Let me be direct with you from the outset because what is unfolding in the Persian Gulf right now demands directness. What we are witnessing is not a routine naval rotation. It is not a symbolic show of force. What we are witnessing is the quiet deployment of Chinese naval infrastructure that fundamentally alters the balance of power in the most strategic waterway on Earth. I am looking at shipping manifests and satellite tracking data that has been circulating among Western naval intelligence analysts for the past 11 days. What this data shows is not an aircraft carrier strike group. It is not a destroyer flotilla. It is not even a submarine deployment in the traditional sense. What it shows is the arrival of 3 Type 093B attack submarines, 4 Type 054A frigates, and something far more significant that almost nobody is discussing: 2 floating maintenance and supply platforms specifically designed for sustained operations thousands of miles from Chinese shores. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this deployment represents China's first permanent naval presence in the Persian Gulf, why the timing of this arrival is no coincidence, and why the strategic implications are already showing up in global energy markets whether you realize it or not. This analysis is based on confirmed reporting from multiple defense publications, satellite imagery analysis, and on-the-record statements from naval officials in 3 different countries. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is not speculation. This is happening right now today, April 29th, 2026. Now, let's start with geography, because geography determines everything in this theater. The Persian Gulf is not like the South China Sea or the Mediterranean. It is a shallow body of water, roughly 9 or 90 kilometers long and averaging just 50 meters in depth at its deepest points. To put that in perspective, American nuclear submarines require a minimum operating depth of 150 meters for optimal performance. The Persian Gulf is too shallow for them to operate effectively. This is not my assessment. This is basic hydrographic reality that every naval planner understands. The strategic choke point here is the Strait of Hormuz, just 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through this strait every single day. That represents roughly 21% of global petroleum liquids consumption. Commander Sarah Mitchell of the U.S. Naval War College has stated publicly that the Strait of Hormuz is, and I am quoting her directly here, the single most important strategic choke point for global energy security in the 21st century. China understands this geography better than anyone because China is the largest importer of oil that transits through Hormuz. According to data from the International Energy Agency, 48% of Chinese crude oil imports pass through this single waterway. When you import that much of your energy through one narrow passage, you do not leave its security to someone else. You deploy your own assets to protect it. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Announcement number 1, the Type 093B attack submarines. And this one matters more than anything else because these are not the submarines China has been deploying to the Indian Ocean for anti-piracy operations. The Type 093B is China's newest variant of the Shang-class nuclear attack submarine, featuring what Western naval analysts describe as significantly improved acoustic quieting technology compared to earlier models. Defense Security Asia reported on April 18th that 3 of these submarines departed Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island on March 29th. They were tracked by satellite through the Malacca Strait, across the Indian Ocean, and into the Gulf of Oman. On April 15th, all 3 submarines were confirmed in Persian Gulf waters by regional maritime tracking systems. Captain Thomas Reynolds, a retired U.S. submarine warfare officer, now with the Center for Naval Analyses, told Defense News that the deployment of 3 nuclear attack submarines simultaneously to this theater is, and again I am quoting directly, unprecedented for the People's Liberation Army Navy and signals a strategic shift from episodic presence to persistent deployment. The Type 093B is approximately 110 meters long with a submerged displacement of roughly 7,000 tons. These submarines carry YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles with a range exceeding 540 kilometers, as well as U-6 torpedoes and potential land attack cruise missile capabilities. But the weapons loadout is not what makes this deployment strategically significant. What makes it significant is that China now has 3 hunter-killer submarines operating in the same waters where American, British, and French naval assets have operated unchallenged for decades. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2. The floating support infrastructure. This is the part that confirms this is not a temporary deployment, and this is the part Western media is almost completely ignoring. On April 22nd, satellite imagery captured by commercial observation platforms showed two large auxiliary vessels entering the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. These are Type 903A replenishment ships, each displacing approximately 23,000 tons and equipped with comprehensive underway replenishment capabilities. But more importantly, accompanying these replenishment vessels were two semi-submersible maintenance platforms that the diplomat described as mobile submarine tenders capable of conducting repairs, crew rotations, and resupply operations without requiring port facilities. Stay with me because this is where the operational implications become impossible to ignore. When a Navy deploys submarines with dedicated maintenance and supply infrastructure, it is not planning a 2-month patrol. It is establishing a sustained presence. The U.S. Navy operates this way in the Mediterranean and the Western Pacific. Russia operates this way in the Eastern Mediterranean. And now China is operating this way in the Persian Gulf. Bloomberg reported on April 24th that insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London have begun factoring increased naval complexity in Hormuz transit risk assessments. What that corporate language actually means is that the insurance industry recognizes that there are now three major naval powers operating in the same confined waterway with competing strategic interests, and that increases the probability of miscalculation. The reason this infrastructure matters is the same reason the United States maintains forward naval bases in Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Diego Garcia. You cannot project sustained naval power 7,000 kilometers from your home ports without logistics support. For decades, China lacked this capability in the Persian Gulf. They had to rely on occasional port visits to Pakistan and agreements with regional states for limited access. Now they have brought their own floating support infrastructure. They do not need anyone's permission to stay. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The timing of this deployment coincides exactly with the collapse of the latest U.S. to Iran nuclear framework negotiations and the escalation of tensions between Washington and Tehran over uranium enrichment levels. On March 15th, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran had begun enriching uranium to 84% purity at its Fordo facility. That is weapons-grade enrichment. The United States responded with additional sanctions targeting Iranian oil exports and threatened military action against enrichment sites. European allies urged restraint. And on March 28th, exactly one day before the Chinese submarines departed Yulin Naval Base, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi held a 4-hour meeting in Beijing with Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian. We do not have a transcript of that meeting. But we do have what happened immediately after. China deployed its largest naval task force ever to the Persian Gulf, and on April 10th, Iran announced it would begin routing 30% of its oil exports through a new Chinese-financed port facility at Chabahar instead of through Karg Island terminals that are more exposed to potential American airstrikes. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States threatens military action against a country and China responds by deploying submarines and establishing naval infrastructure in the same theater, that is not coincidence. That is not diplomatic posturing. That is a signal that any American military action against Iranian nuclear sites will occur in waters where Chinese naval assets are present and where miscalculation could trigger a confrontation between two nuclear powers. Reuters reported on April 26th that the Pentagon has quietly begun revising its contingency planning for strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities specifically to account for third-party naval presence complications. That is Pentagon bureaucratic language for we now have to plan our operations around Chinese submarines. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The first story is the one you are hearing everywhere: increased tensions between the United States and Iran over nuclear enrichment. That story is real and it matters. But the second story, the one that explains why China is deploying attack submarines right now, is about the fundamental restructuring of global energy security architecture. The United States has guaranteed freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz since the end of the Second World War. That guarantee has been backed by the presence of the U.S. Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain and the ability to deploy carrier strike groups to the region within days. For 80 years, that arrangement worked because no other country had the naval capability or the strategic interest to challenge it. But here is what has changed. China now imports more oil from the Persian Gulf than the United States consumes domestically. According to the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, China imported an average of 3 million barrels per day in 2025. Of that total, 1 million barrels per day originated from Persian Gulf producers, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and the UAE. The United States, by contrast, imported just 2 million barrels per day from the entire region. When you are more dependent on a resource than the country currently guaranteeing access to that resource, and when that guarantor country is increasingly treating your primary suppliers as adversaries, you have two choices. You can hope the arrangement continues to work in your favor, or you can deploy your own military assets to ensure your interests are protected regardless of what Washington decides to do. China has chosen option two, and they are doing it in a way that avoids direct confrontation while establishing facts on the water that cannot be easily reversed. The French newspaper Le Monde reported on April 20th that during a closed-door NATO naval coordination meeting, a senior U.S. admiral described the Chinese deployment as strategically rational from Beijing's perspective, even if it complicates our operational freedom. That phrasing is important. The admiral did not say it was aggressive. He did not say it was illegal. He said it was rational and that it complicates American freedom of action. That is an acknowledgement that China has changed the rules of the game. President Biden, speaking at a press conference on April 23rd, was asked directly whether the Chinese naval presence would affect U.S. military options regarding Iran. His response, "We retain all options to defend American interests and the interests of our allies in the region." Notice what he did not say. He did not say the Chinese presence would be irrelevant to U.S. decision making. He used the word retain, which is diplomatic language for we are still deciding how to operate in this new environment. If you own a business that relies on global supply chains, what is happening in the Persian Gulf right now is not a foreign policy story. It is a logistics cost story. If you heat your home with oil or drive a vehicle, it is an energy price story. The addition of a third major naval power to the most important energy choke point on Earth increases uncertainty and markets price in uncertainty with risk premiums. Brent crude oil prices have increased 11% since the Chinese submarines were first detected entering the Persian Gulf. That is not coincidence. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Let me give you the clearest historical parallel because it explains exactly where this is heading. The Peloponnesian War, Athens and Sparta, the two dominant Greek powers, went to war in 431 BC. They fought for 27 years. Both city-states exhausted their treasuries, destroyed their armies, and weakened their political systems. And who won? Neither of them. Macedon, a previously peripheral kingdom to the north, rose to dominate all of Greece within a generation after the war ended. The parallel is not perfect, but the pattern is exact. The United States and Iran have been locked in escalating confrontation for over 40 years. Both countries have spent enormous resources on this rivalry. The United States has military bases surrounding Iran. Iran has developed asymmetric capabilities to threaten U.S. interests. Both sides are exhausted by the conflict, though neither will admit it publicly. And who is positioned to benefit from their mutual exhaustion? China. China is not fighting Iran. China is Iran's largest trading partner. China is not fighting the United States. China is America's largest trading competitor. But by establishing a permanent naval presence in the Persian Gulf, while Washington and Tehran remain focused on each other, China is securing its energy interests and expanding its strategic position in a region where it previously had minimal military footprint. The United States is Athens, Iran is Sparta, China is Macedon. The parallel is exact, so where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths forward because there is no honest middle ground here, and I want you to understand the range of possibilities. Path 1, diplomatic accommodation. The United States, China, and regional Gulf states negotiate a multilateral framework for shared security responsibilities in the Persian Gulf. This would require Washington to accept Chinese naval presence as legitimate, China to commit to coordinated rather than competitive operations, and Gulf states to balance their relationships between Washington and Beijing without choosing sides. For this path to work, you would need several things to happen. First, the Biden administration would have to abandon the idea that American naval primacy in the Gulf is non-negotiable. Second, China would have to provide transparency about its deployment intentions and coordinate with U.S. Fifth Fleet operations. Third, Iran would have to freeze its nuclear enrichment program to remove the immediate crisis that makes everyone nervous about military miscalculation. I assess the probability of this path at less than 20% because it requires all parties to compromise on core strategic interests simultaneously, and nothing in the current diplomatic environment suggests that level of coordination is possible. Path 2. managed competition. The United States and China maintain separate naval deployments in the Gulf, establish deconfliction protocols to avoid accidents, but do not coordinate strategically. This is essentially what exists right now in the South China Sea. Both navies operate in the same waters. Both claim they are protecting freedom of navigation. Both occasionally have close encounters, but neither side wants actual conflict, so they establish communication channels to manage incidents. For this path to materialize, you would see several indicators. Increased communication between U.S. Central Command and Chinese Naval Task Force commanders, possibly joint rescue or anti piracy operations as confidence building measures, parallel but non overlapping patrol patterns, and most importantly, both Washington and Beijing would stop describing each other's presence as destabilizing and instead normalize the idea of dual naval presence. I think we are closer to Path 2 than the headlines suggest. Despite the rhetoric, neither the United States nor China wants a military confrontation in the Persian Gulf. Both countries need Gulf oil to keep flowing. Both countries benefit from avoiding conflict. The question is whether mid level commanders in both navies can maintain discipline during close encounters, because the risk in this scenario is not intentional escalation. The risk is an accident that neither capital city wanted, but that both countries feel compelled to respond to for domestic political reasons. Path 3: escalation and retrenchment. Tensions between the United States and Iran escalate to military confrontation. Chinese submarines are present during that confrontation. An incident occurs between U.S. and Chinese forces, and the crisis expands beyond the original Iran nuclear issue into a broader U.S. China confrontation. This would likely trigger Chinese retrenchment from forward deployments as both sides pull back from the brink, or alternatively, it accelerates the Chinese naval buildup as Beijing concludes it needs even more robust presence to deter future U.S. actions. This is the path nobody wants, but that becomes more probable the longer multiple nuclear armed navies operate in confined waters during periods of heightened regional tension. The triggers would be U.S. airstrikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, Iranian retaliation against U.S. bases or naval vessels, Chinese submarines positioning themselves in potential strike corridors, and a U.S. destroyer or aircraft interpreting Chinese submarine movement as hostile intent. I assess this path as low probability but high consequence, probably less than 10% chance in the next 6 months, but if it happens, the consequences reshape the entire global security architecture. Here are the questions I want you to take away from this analysis. First, how long can the United States maintain its claim to unilateral security responsibility for the Persian Gulf when it is no longer the primary consumer of Gulf energy? Second, what does Chinese military presence in the Gulf mean for smaller regional states like the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait that host American military bases but also have growing economic ties to China? And third, what happens to global oil markets if the current uneasy coexistence between US and Chinese naval forces breaks down into open confrontation? Tell me in the comments what you think happens next. Tell me if you think Washington can negotiate shared security arrangements with Beijing, or if you think we are heading toward a more serious confrontation. Tell me which path you think is most likely and what indicators you are watching. We will keep tracking every development in the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, and every other theater where great power competition is reshaping the international order. That is what this channel does every single day. We bring you the analysis that connects the dots mainstream media either cannot see or will not report. Subscribe now, share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is really happening in the most strategically important waterway on Earth. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update as this situation continues to develop, and we will see you in the next analysis.